à Montréal, bienvenue à l'UQAM, bienvenue à la Chaire Raoul-Dandurand, bienvenue à l'Association canadienne sur la sécurité climatique. Welcome to Montreal, to UQAM, Chaire Raoul-Dandurand, and the Climate Security Association of Canada. My name is Bruno Charbonneau. I'm professor at the Royal Military College Saint-Jean, president of the Climate Security Association of Canada, one of the scientific director at la Chaire Raoul-Dandurand, and senior scientific advisor at Casco as well, so a few hats. I'm very happy to see you all here this morning. Je suis très heureux de vous voir ici ce matin. Je vois des visages familiers, je devrais dire, mais aussi des nouveaux visages. Donc, I'm very happy to see like new faces, but also old friends and colleagues coming back to Montreal. So that's always a good sign. This year's theme on climate security future, on the futures of climate war and climate peace, is for me a way to interrogate the temporal politics of climate change and climate security. So I'm hoping that in IR, as we love to talk about space, we talk a little bit about time over the next few days, the temporal politics, what it means to talk about climate change, what sort of future we're working towards. Especially these days, I don't have to tell you about the news. My view is that we cannot avoid making the future. We cannot avoid talking about the future. We can make claims about it in normal times, but not when it comes to climate change. It's a bit different. It's a bit, obviously, as you know, more dramatic, or certainly more important as far as I'm concerned. Talking about climate security in the future, though, the futures of climate security is also very much about making this future, and that means talking about the present, how we build the future in the present, but a present that is always rooted in the past. So I'm very much interested in what you're thinking and your thoughts about this future. The future we're trying to build in the present where we will argue about that, I guess. Climate change is not seen as an urgency anymore, perhaps, or certainly we don't talk as much about it as we used to be 3, 4, 5 years ago. So, and I look forward to hearing about what your thoughts are on this, what the consequences, and all of that. So I won't be talking too much, but before I present, I leave the floor to Gabrielle, my colleague and friend from CSAC. I want to thank this year's financial sponsor to our conference, without whom this would be impossible. So at la Chaire Raoul-Dandurand, the center that I run, FrancoPaix, we have the support. We've had the support for 10 years of the Organisation internationale en francophonie. Donc, depuis 10 ans, le Centre FrancoPaix de la Chaire Raoul-Dandurand a le soutien et l'appui financier de l'Organisation internationale de la francophonie, que je remercie de tout cœur très chaleureusement. Et nous avons aussi le soutien de MINDS, qui est le programme de la Défense nationale du Canada, MINDS being a National Defense Program from the Department of National Defense in Ottawa. But also beyond that, obviously, I want to thank the team at La Chaire Raoul-Dandurand in particular. Louis, François, Daphne in the back. They're all in the back. You've heard about them. You'll see them. But if you haven't met them yet, go say thanks. Without them, obviously, this sort of stuff is impossible. Stéphanie Roulier aussi, who's not here. Stéphanie has been working with me for several years now. I want to thank her. Et aussi, je veux remercier évidemment mes amis et collègues qui croient en CSAC et qui l'ont lancé notamment avec moi, Tom et Gabrielle. We had a crazy idea at ISA. Where was that again? Was that the Montreal ISA? Can't recall. 4 or 5 years ago. Anyway, over beer. And we were like, let's add some more work to our list, something else to do because we have a lot of free time on our hands. But we're happy with the result. And so thank you guys for being with us. The other founder, Will Greaves, for those who don't know, a professor at the University of Victoria, has now been elected to Parliament in Canada, in Ottawa. So he's not with us today because I guess he's packing boxes to move or something like that. So, Gabrielle?
Thank you, Bruno. My name's, bonjour, hello, my name is Gabrielle Daoust, and I'm based at the University of Northern British Columbia in Canada, and I'm also a member of the CSAC board committee. I'm not actually sure I can't remember what the title is. As I was thinking about some, I guess, words of welcome. I was thinking back to when we started, I guess, planning for this conference about a year ago, or at least mobilizing funding for the conference, when we had been thinking about approaching this topic through national, regional, and international dynamics of climate security, climate insecurity. A year ago, it was, I guess, a world that was slightly different than it is today. And so the conversations today, that we'll have today and tomorrow, feel in some ways slightly more urgent, but perhaps have always been very urgent. Part of the, I guess, intent with this conference is to advance, in some ways, CSAC's role as a forum, a space for dialogue and for collaboration, or thinking about possible collaborations on climate change and insecurity across policy, practice, and academia. And as I was scanning the program for the today and tomorrow's sessions, I think that's reflected in the mix of academics, of policymakers, of practitioners who will be speaking about climate and security dynamics across a range of geographies, across a range of thematic areas, thinking about what, or talking about what security means in relation to climate change for humans, for people, for states, for regional or international organizations from a post-human perspective. And I was looking back at some of the other notes in my notebook, and I cannot remember in what context I'd written this down, but it was clearly from some talk over the past year that I noted that, thinking of climate change as context rather than topic, and I think that's also reflected in the range of presentations and conversations that will take place over the next couple of days. I think that's really, all that I had to say in terms of thinking about what I hope to get out of this conference, and I think what some of the intentions behind organizing this kind of space were in terms of CSAC's role, and thinking of how this can be strengthened as a forum for this kind of cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary dialogue. So welcome all, and I'm looking forward to hearing all of you speak over the coming days.
Yes. Merci beaucoup, Gabrielle. Thank you very much. It must be said that Gabrielle was the one who led the effort behind the Minds funding grant application this year. So thank you again. And I'm looking at Tom for maybe next year, right? You're taking it over. So just a few words on logistics. Very quickly, this year is hybrid, so we have a bunch of speakers online, some by choice, others because, well, I say it every year, but Canada, unfortunately, has issues with giving visa to all sorts of people, so a few of them could not make it because of that this year, so now they'll be online. Most people online, I think, are this morning, the 2 sessions this morning, I think, but maybe a bit tomorrow as well. Please enjoy the conversation, and on that, I ask the first panel to join us here on the stage. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good day.
My name is Tom Deligiannis. I'm a lecturer at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario, and I want to welcome you as another one of the board of CSAC to our conference. In our first panel, we have a mix of scholars from different parts of the world looking at different issues to get us started. I'm going to ask the panelists to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes max so that we have enough time for questions, if that's all right. And I'm going to go in the order of the panel as it's listed on our program. We have a couple of presenters who are joining us online. Just quickly going through everybody, we have Lina Aburas Awadalla from the University of Ottawa, who's going to be joining us online. Lennard de Klerk as well, who's joining us online. Uche Okpara, who's joining us online as well. And then Cagdas, Dedeoglu, and Ali Tkachenko. Did I get that okay? Thank you. I'll introduce each of our speakers in order just to give a few more details about everybody. Now, Lina is a doctoral candidate in International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa. Her research focuses on the climate security nexus in Nigeria, where she examines climate conflict patterns and how actors perceive this relationship. Prior to her doctoral work, she worked for the ICRC in several countries: Nigeria, Iraq, Syria, Israel and Palestine, and Ukraine. Okay, Lina, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the very warm introduction. So yes, so my presentation today really centers around my field work as a humanitarian worker and my PhD research in general. And it's based on my mission that I spent in Nigeria as a humanitarian worker with the Red Cross, where I was based in hard-to-reach areas or areas inaccessible often to people other than humanitarian workers who can access to deliver vital humanitarian aid. So the research really focuses on the climate and security relationship, and Nigeria is a fascinating case study because the country is affected by different types of violence across the country. So comparing the different manifestations of climate change and the different conflict and violence dynamics really are an important qualitative case study that will further help us understand just how complex this relationship is. And my angle in this presentation is to focus on knowledge construction and who counts as a knowledge contributor, because when we are delivering policies and when we are talking about the climate and security relationship, we often we are so focused on delivering these policies and addressing the needs of the people it affects. However, I was curious to learn how often are these people included in formulating the problem. So are they just approached and told, okay, here's a solution to the climate and security problem in your area, and this is how we're addressing it, or are they also part of the formulation of the issue? Because policies need to serve the people who are most affected on the ground. So I just wanted to emphasize that according to a study done by the ICRC in 2020, 60% of the 20 most climate vulnerable countries are conflict-affected areas, that they're already affected by other very complex issues. And Nigeria, as a case study, really is important in understanding this. Just a little bit about the field work. So it's based on more than 82, I think I have 82 semi-structured interviews and 14 focus group discussions on multiple levels. So starting from the grassroots level with the affected population all the way up to senior advisors to highest officials in the government of Nigeria. So it is to understand how the relationship of climate and insecurity is perceived by all these different actors. Is it similar? What are the discrepancies? And how do we go from there to effectively address it? These are the field sites. So it was ideally to cover multiple sites in Nigeria, and there's quite a lot of thought went into it. I won't go into the selection of the sites too much, but main concerns was also access and to participants and access to the data itself. So my main leading question here is whose knowledge is shaping the understanding of the climate insecurity relationship in Nigeria. So are the people who are at the grassroots level included? Their experiences, are they included as much as maybe other groups in the community who are maybe better connected, or is there any other criteria that is defining this? So I was looking at the grassroots level, then the local government level, state, federal, and how the federal level also includes global initiatives such as, for example, their commitments towards the Paris Agreement, NDCs, the different climate policies. How are these policies also integrated in Nigeria, and how are they trickled down all the way to the grassroots level? So it kind of feeds into a circle. One of the things that I really wanted to emphasize that is just pouring out of my results, because I'm currently in the phase of processing my results, that knowledge is political, definitely. And when it comes to the relationship between climate and insecurity, security actors tend to dominate the narrative. So in which sense? So when there is a complex relationship between, when there's a complex problem in a region and insecurity is such an important component, the insecurity narrative tends to dominate the climate one. For example, in the northeast of the country, where the insurgency of the colloquially known Boko Haram terrorist group is very dominant, the security apparatus functions completely separately from from the community engagement. So when we compare, for example, other types of violence in the country, like criminality, banditry, and kidnapping, the communication with security agencies works a bit differently. Community knowledge is often informal, overlooked, but deeply insightful. So what I also learned is that while communities, for example, understand the situation, they understand what climate change is, they have a very rich understanding and a very rich explanation for climate change. So for example, they have local names for it. They're often very descriptive. Is it describing the changing of the seasons when, they describe it through generations. So for example, when my grandfather was farming, this is what the climate looked like. Today, this is how it looks like, how it's affecting their insecurity and so on. So this was something that was absolutely fascinating to learn from the communities. And it was also fascinating to see that in every region, the local communities would have different names for climate change. So, for example, they had the direct translation, changing Yinei in Hausa, which directly means climate change, but they also had different local ones, Riki, Hamada, and so on, that they attached these descriptive notions to. Interestingly enough, when I was talking to policymakers in Nigeria about that, there was little connection between the local understandings of climate change and on the grassroots level and on the federal level. So the federal level was really focused on, trying to trickle down the global policies. However, knowledge was not trickling up from the local levels, and that knowledge was quite rich. So the current policy in Nigeria is really driven by the geopolitical and donor priorities. So Nigeria is really focused on, meeting its commitments under the Paris agreements. This is what I was really told by the participants, the policymakers that are working on the federal level to implement these policies. They're really focused on, diversifying Nigeria's economy from being a mono economy that is very focused on oil to diversifying it a little bit more and reducing their carbon emissions through that way. However, one of the main concerns raised was that the communication and the information flow between the the federal level and the grassroots level just is not there. So knowledge exists on the local level, knowledge exists on the federal level, but that exchange is quite challenging, and it is one of the main reasons where we have a disparity in policy application. One of the things that I also wanted really to highlight in this presentation is that without the inclusion of the population at the grassroots level, it is very difficult to tailor policies that will directly address their needs. And I would like to emphasize through one example of practice of tree cutting in Nigeria. So, for example, tree cutting has been an activity that a lot of grassroots communities engaged in as just another socio-economic activity to generate income. However, with the raging conflict, especially in the Northeast, in addition to the desertification, in addition to the lack of rainfall, the number of available trees is reducing. So a lot of state authorities, especially in the northern states in Nigeria, criminalized tree cutting for commercial purposes, which means that if you are found cutting more than 2 trees, you can be fined or jailed. They have a policy of if you cut a tree, plant 2 instead. So what happened was that a lot of people who are have their livelihoods affected now, for example, a farmer their crops don't yield enough harvest as before because of the changing climate, or because they don't have access to their farms anymore because of the conflict. They would subsidize that also with tree cutting. Now when tree cutting got criminalized, they lost their second coping mechanism. So they turned to banditry and kidnapping. So this was really highlighted by a lot of participants is in the different northeastern states in Nigeria, where they said, some people that I know would, start participating in, they would erect a checkpoint and kidnap people for ransom because there's just not, the amount of coping mechanisms has significantly reduced. And one of the participants really emphasized that by saying, if only the policy of criminalizing tree cutting was discussed first with the grassroots communities before implementing it, it would have reduced maybe the amount of violence that is now increasing when it comes to from banditry and kidnapping, which speaks how important it is to understand the needs and the reality on the ground, and trying to tailor policy that will primarily serve the ones most affected. So I thought that would be an excellent example just to highlight the richness of the data in 10 minutes. This is, I'm afraid, all I could really go into in details. And some of the preliminary recommendations that I'm having is that local communities and practitioners are knowledge producers. They're not only knowledge receivers. And this is very important in designing policy that is going to be successful and that is going to serve the ones that are on the ground. And it needs to respond to lived vulnerabilities and not abstract risks. And whose knowledge counts really shapes whose lives are protected. And that is absolutely important when it comes to effective policymaking in the climate and security relationship in Nigeria. Nigeria is an excellent case study because, as I said, qualitative data from conflict-affected areas helps us understand this problem on the global level. And I'm really hoping that it will help shape conversations in other parts of the world and in other areas of policymaking when it comes to climate change and insecurity. So that is all from me. Yes, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lina. I'd like to turn it over to Lennard de Klerk for our next presentation. Lennard is the head of the Initiative on Greenhouse Gas Accounting of War, investigating the impact of conflicts on the climate system. Previously, he worked on climate projects to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in heavy industry in Russia and Ukraine. And as I said, Lennard is joining us online. Go ahead, Lennard.
Yes, good morning to all of you from Europe. Sorry that I couldn't be there in person, but I'm happy to be able to contribute to this conference. Indeed, I'm representing a group of carbon experts that looked into or that convened after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation, and we basically wanted to see what the impact of this war is on the climate system. Clearly, of course, a conflict or a war mainly impacts people, has a local destruction, but it also has an impact on the climate. And when we started this work, we realized actually that this has never been looked into before, because if we're talking about the climate security nexus, then the impact of climate change on security is very well looked at. But the opposite causal relation, and that is how insecurity accelerates climate change through additional emissions, has not. And basically, you can look in two type of sources of emissions. First of all, the military emissions. So these are what I would call the emissions caused by the militaries when they're at peace, and the military industry that's producing the equipment. And then we can look into the conflict emissions, and those are those emissions that can be directly attributed to conflict. And so far, we are now more than 3 years into the war in Ukraine. In the meantime, we've seen the Israel-Gaza conflict started, and these two conflicts have been researched now. I will be mainly focusing on the conflict emissions from Ukraine, but I will also touch at the end a little bit on the Gaza, the war in Gaza, but also the military emissions that are going up very quickly. And here you just see an overview of the greenhouse gas emissions of 3 years of war. These are preliminary results, and we're working on the final document now. But basically, we're talking about 230 million tons of CO2 after 3 years of war. And just to give you a feeling, this is the same as what combined emissions of Austria, Hungary, Czech Republic, and Slovakia in a year. So we're talking about significant emissions. And I will very briefly, given the limited amount of time, touch upon some of these sources. But as you can see here, is the warfare itself is significant. Also, the fires from landscape fires like forests and other landscapes, but also the future reconstruction of what has been destroyed is significant. And here you can see how it has been growing over the years, over the 3 years. And as you can see, warfare keeps on growing because the war is continuing. Reconstruction emissions haven't grown that fast, but that's because most of the damage was done in the early weeks and months of the war. And since then, the front line has been relatively static. So what could have been destroyed, unfortunately, already has been destroyed. And just focusing on warfare emissions, you can actually see that the majority of the emissions is not from explosions or missiles or ammunition, but it is mainly the fossil fuel consumption by both armies. So it's the Russian army attacking Ukraine and the Ukrainians defending their country. Use of ammunition is fairly small. but also other sources are, for example, the construction of fortifications. So we're talking about cement and steel that's being needed for those. And as you might know, these are very carbon-intensive construction materials. And here just an overview of this use of ammunition. So when we started our work, actually nobody really had looked into the carbon emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions of explosions. But as you can see, that the emissions at the point of firing and at the point of impact is very small, can be neglected. The emissions are in the manufacturing of the ammunition and the propellants. So we're talking again about steel casing and the explosives. Here you can see the fires in Ukraine. This is for 2024, and where you see a red dot, that is a point of a fire, which is obviously along the front line. But 2024 was a very intensive, so many forest fires, and actually here you can see a combination of climate change and conflict, because it was an extremely hot and dry summer in particularly in eastern Ukraine in 2024. So it created the conditions for a lot of fires, and if you then have a lot of ignition points due to the war fighting, those fires, you have many more fires that start. And as the firefighters cannot extinguish the fires rage on for much longer and much more intensive. So the emissions from the forest fires was 20 to 30 times more than in an average year. So here you see how climate change and the conflicts are actually reinforcing each other. And here you can basically see the temperature anomalies in 1 week in July 2024, and as you can see, the eastern part of Europe was extremely hot. Interestingly enough, is what you first would not expect, but as a result of the war and actually of the sanctions, Russia has closed the airspace above Siberia for flights from airlines of what they call unfriendly states. So, for example, on flights between Frankfurt and Beijing, normally you would fly over Russia. At least Lufthansa cannot anymore. So they have to take a detour, and that's increasing the flight time, increasing kerosene consumption, and hence increasing emissions. London, Tokyo is even bigger. Used to be 11 hours, and now we're talking about 15 hours flight, because they have to go over Greenland and northern Canada. But also here, on the bottom, you can see a flight between Toronto and Seoul. This is a MacArthur projection. So the upper line actually is the shortest one. It used to be just over 13 hours. Now, because the airline cannot fly over Russia anymore, the flight is 14 hours. It also works the other way around. Russian airlines are banned from European space, so Kaliningrad to Moscow used to go over Lithuania, and then have to fly all over the Baltic Sea to reach the destination. As you can see, these are significant increases of kerosene consumption and hence of emissions. Reconstruction, as I said, is a very important section, and that is because of the awful amount of concrete and steel that you have to use in the reconstruction. As you can see, is if you look at different type of buildings and the content of the carbon emissions, about 75 to 80% of the carbon emissions are caused by using concrete and steel. So this is a very significant. At the same time, this is also an opportunity for Ukraine to reconstruct in a more sustainable way, because we're talking about emissions that will happen in the future. And I must say, it's amazing to see how the Ukrainians, despite that the war is still ongoing and that they're daily, attacked by missiles, there is already a lot of brainstorming going on how the reconstruction can be done in a more sustainable way. And for example, using alternative construction materials like, for example, hemp, which the Ukrainians as an agricultural powerhouse can grow themselves. As I mentioned, the Gaza conflict, we've working now on a peer review paper to get a better estimation on the emissions caused by this conflict. I cannot give the results yet, but some highlights. I mean, it's an asymmetrical warfare, so most emissions are caused by the Israeli Defense Force. Again, mainly by the fossil fuel consumption of the military. The level of destruction is extremely high, so the reconstruction of everything that has been destroyed will be significant. But again, also here we've seen impact on international transport, shipping this time, as we all know that the Houthis are attacking ships in the Red Sea. Meaning that some ships avoid the Red Sea and have to go all the way around southern Africa, increasing diesel consumption. This is also a very large conflict in geographical terms, because many countries are impacted, like southern Lebanon, Syria, Iran, and Yemen. But as I mentioned, this study is currently going through peer review, and we hope to be able to publish it soon. Closing remarks, and that's on military missions. We do not know much about military missions because they are unfortunately not reporting their emissions, or very few do, on incomplete. But the best guess that we have is that the total military missions of the militaries and the military industry represents 5.5% of world emissions. So that exceeds the international and aviation and shipping combined. And most of these military missions are in the so-called hard-to-abate categories. So this is mobile fossil fuel use, production of the equipment is steel, is difficult to decarbonize. So this is a very difficult sector, I would say, to decarbonize. But with this renewed arms race we're seeing now, it looks like that the military emissions will explode. I mean, if we're talking in Europe, about 2%, or before the conflict, it was 1.5% of GDP. It's now about 3.5 or to 5% of GDP, meaning that these emissions will go up very steep. That's also what we're investigating at the moment, and try to estimate how the military emissions, particularly in NATO countries, excluding the US, will increase. We've done a small case study. We're also hoping to be able to publish that very soon. But as you can imagine, if you go from 1.5% to 3.5%, you can imagine that the emissions will increase steeply as well. At the same time, on a positive note, if you want to decarbonize, you need to invest. We did not invest maybe too much in the military, so they also had no opportunity to green themselves. So let's also hope that this renewed investment in the militaries, and that's mainly happening in Europe, of course, is also an opportunity to look for low carbon solutions. And we really hope that the military will, in this way, also be to be able to categorize and develop some technologies that civil society then also can use for future decarbonization. Okay, that's the end of my contribution. Here you can see a link, and if you want to download our preliminary reports, please scan this QR code. Okay, that's all. Tom, back to you.
Thank you, Lennard. Appreciate your contribution. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Uche Okpara. Uche is a senior lecturer specializing in climate change, state fragility and conflict, and a UK Research and Innovation Futures Leader Fellow at the University of Greenwich. He also leads the Prosperity and Peace Pathways Project, working with a team of researchers across the Lake Chad region to find transformative change and pathways. Uche is going to be joining us online as well, and I turn it over to you now, Uche.
All right, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. My name is Uche Okpara. I'll be speaking to you today about an ongoing research my team and I are conducting in the Lake Chad region. So envisioning peace through citizen engagement amidst climate change. The Prosperity and Peace Pathway Project is an ongoing project that I'm coordinating around the Lake Chad region, and this is funded by the UK Research and Innovation. So this project has been engaging Lake Chad citizens since 2020 to understand ways in which we could initiate transformative change that could enable co-creation of peace and prosperity pathways. Lake Chad region is a well-researched area in terms of the connection between climate and conflict. The region is located between Nigeria, Chad, Cameroon, and Niger. And in that region, approximately 6 out of 10 citizens experience violence daily, and up to 7.2 million people live in extreme poverty. The project I'm leading established a transboundary citizens lab. So we call these transboundary citizens labs, and there are 3 arms to the labs. We've got the Bono Citizens Lab based in Nigeria, the N'Djamena Citizens Lab based in Chad, and the Difa Citizens Lab based in Niger Republic. So what we do basically is to use our labs as a platform to harness citizens' collective intelligence, creativity, and wisdom to enable envisioning and co-creation of meaningful pathways towards prosperity and peace. So our labs basically serve as a constructivist classroom. And within the labs, we do a lot of participatory activities, brainstorming, questioning, visioning, data collection, co-creation, knowledge sharing, and our labs involve a diverse and inclusive range of citizens who normally will not work together. So what we've been able to do so far has been to break epistemic hierarchies and to ensure that local people's knowledge are integrated into decision making. Now, in terms of envisioning peace, the main challenge concerning this work was to really understand whether there are unique ways to envision peace in places where climate and conflict converge. In the Lake Chad region, for example, many peace strategies have failed to integrate citizens' knowledge. And what we do with our lab has been to ensure that our citizens' knowledge are used in rethinking and reshaping peace strategies. So in terms of peace visioning, we used multi-factor mapping within the TCL system to envision peace pathways in the Lake Chad region. And the process we explored involved 5 interlinked phases. So the phases are basically what you can see on the screen here. So the first thing we did was to map climate conflict risk within the lab. And in doing that, we asked citizens to explain to us what the current climate conflict threats they face are currently. And secondly, we identified peace pillars, stability foundations. So we asked them to explain the foundation they think that should be in place to enable peace to happen. What pillars of peace are missing? And then we looked at levers of change. So we mapped levers of change, that is action levers. And we asked them to identify the levers that can be activated now for peace to happen. And thereafter, we mapped the political economy. We looked at issues around power, around interest, incentive, ideology, institutions, who holds power, and how can we work with those who hold power. And under phase E, as you can see on the screen, we began to envision, peace, the kind of peace outcomes that local people, envisage. And we also asked them, for example, if we achieve all envisioned peace outcomes, what society will you have in 2050? So we used this framework, this peace outcomes and peace futures. So I will talk you through each of these phases and how we navigated each of them. Now, in terms of climate conflict risk that threatens the Lake Chad region, like I said earlier, Lake Chad is a well-researched region, and then local people are concerned about the range of drought issues, flooding, and desertification issues they face in the region. And these have been, triggering violence and competition in the region. Displacement is rampant, migration is rampant, and all of this integrates to create sort of erosion of livelihood assets. And there is massive food insecurity, there is livelihood insecurity. People are becoming defenseless, powerless, weak, and young people are increasingly recruited into arms group. And we try to find out from them how climate conflict manifests. So citizens clearly told us that climate conflict manifests as a vicious circle where droughts shrink fishing grounds, floods destroy farmlands, pushing young people into armed groups, which then militarize resource access. So this interplay weakens traditional mediation systems, leaving communities to navigate compounding crisis in the midst of dwindling institutional support. So this is their framing of climate conflict challenge across the Lake Chad region. So looking at peace pillars, we asked them what pillars of peace are missing. Pillars of peace, according to local people, are categorized around leadership, agency, and opportunity. So firstly, they identified leadership void. So communities lack leaders who represent all groups. Then under agency, they identified weak climate conflict handling systems. So we often talk about climate handling, conflict handling. But from the local people, we began to see that there are unique ways of looking at climate conflict handling. Okay, and in that region, they've got weak systems that integrates the way in which climate can be handled and conflict can be handled, collectively. So there is distrust. There is the traditional mediation system is increasingly overwhelmed by the scale and complexity of climate conflict in the region, and this is well known. Low level of well-being and limited opportunities for income and climate adaptation. So this is another missing pillar, peace pillar in the region. There is also weak regional cooperation and shared resource management. So these pillars around opportunity, leadership, and agency is pervasive in the region. Now, looking at the third phase, what levers of change can be activated now? Local citizens narrated levers of change around, the common 5 livelihood assets. So they call that livelihood capital levers. So under this, we have financial capital levers, we have the human capital levers, social capital levers, physical capital levers, and natural capital levers. So they felt that these 5 levers, if they are activated at the moment, then it is possible that peace will happen in the region. So who holds power and how can we work with them? Earlier this year, there was a Chad Basin Governors Forum, and all the governors, all the leaders in the region came together to, discuss ways in which stabilization initiative could be advanced in the region. So political economy is a way of understanding where power is held, the interests of power holders, the incentive, values, and institutions that modify and mediate their perception and action. So across the Lake Chad region, we have a range of big actors. So the Lake Chad Basin Commission is one of them, state governors, religious authorities, and traditional rulers. All of these groups, they have different interests and ideology, okay, and their interests and ideology often shape whether peace building or the status quo prevails. So they control access to adaptation projects, they control access to security funding in the region. So I'll take you through briefly these 4 dimensions of political economy: interest, incentive, ideology, and institution. All of the actors, the big actors in the region, they've got different interests and incentive and ideology and institution. And sometimes all of this clash. Okay, and when there is clash in interest and incentive, oftentimes peace, fails to happen. Now, I asked the local people, the citizens, how can we really work with power holders to ensure that visions of peace outcomes could be integrated into peace strategies, in terms of climate change. So, and they suggested that power holders can be engaged effectively through platforms that they trust. So, and the platforms they trust are basically traditional councils, religious forums, and the Lake Chad Basin Commission. So working through this trusted platform can enable the translation of peace visions into tangible, peace-centered adaptation initiatives. There are so many peace-centered initiatives ongoing in the region, but many of them are developed from the top. So citizens feel that their visions of peace should be integrated into peace strategies. So looking at peace outcomes, what peace outcomes do they want? Now, the first thing we did here was to understand what they understand by peace. Of course, peace has different definitions, different meanings. So one of the, majority of the citizens told us that peace is when their children can drink clean water, their cows graze without fear, and local leaders and even politicians can listen to their voices. Peace is about harmony, coexistence, safety, and having a healthy relationship with nature. So they identified 5 peace outcomes. So in doing this, they provided their wish list, that's their aspirations. They provided storylines based on their experiences. Okay, and all of the outcomes they identified were screened through the different phases I had showed you earlier. So these are the 5 outcomes the citizens identified. These outcomes cut across social, economic, and environmental domains. So reliable and fair access to land and water resources, restored and resilient natural environments, vibrant local economy for the youth and women, trust and cooperation between different groups, and safe return and reintegration of displaced families. So 5 key peace outcomes, which they feel should be integrated in peace strategies in the region. Looking post 2050, we asked them to provide storylines about peace futures, and they did that across different timelines. Okay, so as you can see, there is a narrative for 2025. They also give another narrative for 2030, 2035, and 2040. But looking at 2050, the local people said they envisage that communities by 2050 will be vibrant and self-reliant. There will be fair access to land and water. Disputes will be rare, and when they occur, they'll be quickly resolved. The environment is healthy. Displaced people are fully integrated. Trust, cooperation, and shared responsibility define society. So these are the narratives they provide in terms of the future of peace they want to see happen in the region. So yeah, so this is the final slide now. So the key takeaway here is that this visioning process is the first step towards rethinking peace strategies and advancing real change for the region. So the next stage for us is to, find a way to, harvest all of these outcomes and integrate them into policy strategies and provide recommendation to the key players in the Lake Chad region. So sorry for stealing the time. That's all from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Uche. I'd like to turn it over now to Dr. Dedeoglu. Chadish is a professor of liberal studies at Yorkville University in Ontario, and he's the founder of the Post-Human Lab, a not-for-profit research institute. Before moving to Canada, he worked as an assistant professor of political science at various institutions in Istanbul, Turkey, including the National Military University, and he completed his postdoc studies at the University of Florida. Over to you, sir.
All right. Bonjour. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. It's my pleasure to be here alongside those esteemed scholars, researchers, activists. I saw some futurists as well. It's a great pleasure. Today I am presenting a work in progress. I am currently working on a project on political posthumanism, and military education is not my primary field, but I have been working with military officers for a while, since my days at National Military University, and we are trying to find ways to better understand the new security implications of our era, I call post-human era, and how we can make militaries better prepared for this new era. That's one of my goals nowadays. All right, as we know, climate change is widely considered a security challenge nowadays. This was not the case 15 years ago, as Bruno also mentioned, and I also witnessed myself. So it's not whether or not climate change is a security challenge anymore. It is more about how question. And militaries are also becoming part of this debate increasingly, and we know militaries are exhibiting greater attentiveness. So it is not also a question of whether or not militaries are attentive. Maybe not enough, but they are also showing greater attentiveness. Our objectives in this work, therefore, is not about what, it's more about how. And we are working on a framework which is considered an onto-epistemo-ethical framework. We look at these three dimensions, inseparable dimensions. We are following Karen Barat here, how we see the world, how we produce knowledge about it, and how we act upon this knowledge are inseparable. And we are trying to look beyond humanist, anthropocentric, dualist, rationalist, and technologist or technocratic attitudes in acting towards environmental and technological issues. Of course, climate change and climate security lies at the heart of these issues as well. And we try to understand ecological and technological issues within an entangled, networked framing. That's our work in progress currently. And we do not want to ask the questions, how much security, who is the security referent, but we want to look at the underlying conditions. And we assume that we live in a post-human condition. We have two questions. If we all agree that climate change is a challenge, then what is it exactly that militaries should be prepared for? Short answer is a new post-human condition. And the second question, what are the implications of adopting such a framework for the incorporation of climate security into military education? And again, we have ontological, epistemological, methodological, ethical, and pedagogical implications to consider. So this is a comprehensive framework. Again, I don't want to go into details of the three main security discourses, mainly national security, human security, and critical security. I don't intend to go into details of them, but what I want to say here is that our framework doesn't necessarily contradict with them. It's not about where we are looking, it's more about how we are doing this, whether it is national, human security, or more than human security. And we also see, increasingly see, more comprehensive, holistic approaches, as more recently presented by the reports last year, and also more recently, the publication maybe came more recently with the critical perspectives on climate security as well. So these broader perspectives tell us a different story. We should look beyond our current temporal understandings. We should look beyond human rights frameworks which are limited in many aspects. And these integrative strategies also encourage us to continue working on this field. So what is our framework then? Posthumanism is a complex terminology because sometimes people think it is transhumanism, it is enhancing human capacities. We, of course, understand it differently. I have developed a 5-pillar framework following Rosi Braidotti and other post-human philosophers, feminist thinkers. Post-humanism is about the critique of human domination of humans based on race, gender, race, and post-anthropocentrism is about looking beyond humans in our ecosystem thinking. Post-dualism is a critique of thinking within rigid binaries, human, non-human, or even what is normal and what is crisis, or what is status quo, what is crisis as well. I also want to include two more dimensions. Post-enlightenment, which is a critique of autonomous rational individual and its decision-making capabilities. And also post-technologism is about a critique of technocratic thinking, which creates more problems than solutions on most occasions. And our post-human era, what does it mean? We live in a post-human era, but this does not mean that we have not always been post-human. We assume we have always been post-human in terms of ecological entanglements, technological entanglements, whether they are advanced or not. But today's distinct post-human era is defined by 4 main pillars. Climate change, obviously, 6th mass extinction, extinction of species, as well as the implications of the 4th industrial revolution, artificial intelligence and robotics, as well as ongoing, persistent, colonial, post-colonial legacies, extractionist attitudes, and of course shifting geopolitical power. relations. So this is our new post-human era. So posthumanism and the idea of posthuman has already been incorporated into security studies and IR as well. I classified them in three main subfields. Two of them are related to ecological concerns. One of them is related to more maybe quantum ontology ground. And I also want to include a fourth pillar, which is very well discussed in broader post-humanities era, especially if you look at post-human glossary, the entries about violence, surveillance, security, war, resilience. These are providing important critiques that might be helpful to better incorporate the idea of posthuman into the field of security studies. What these three are sub-questions or subfields within IR and security studies, plus entries or works from the field, broader field of posthumanities tell us is that posthuman security should go, of course, beyond the human-centric understanding of security and look at the entanglement of both ecologies and technologies, but at the same time, how we see these entanglements, what we prioritize, and of course, envisioning more just and sustainable futures is the key in our understanding. And when we adopt this perspective into the field of military education, we agree with the suggestions, most of them made in the report. Maybe the only report so far on the relationship between military education and climate change. When we look at the relations between current educational goals and climate-related educational goals, what we prioritize and what we do not prioritize, and the role of senior officers, because younger officers are probably are willing to incorporate climate change-related concerns more eagerly, how we can balance this, how we can use gamification techniques, maybe even video games in today's world, and how we can create a diverse understanding of climate change and respond to it in our education systems. But although we agree on these 4 points, we have 2 hesitations as well. The first one, probably it is not about climate change education. It is about an education that will also prepare militaries for climate change. We don't need to lose the comprehensive outlook here. And the second thing, as I mentioned, this is a new post-human era, but this does not mean that we have not always been post-human. When we look at the fate of soldiers, fighters in the North African deserts during World War II, they also had to face extreme weather conditions, and there were consequences. So what is different today? What should be different today? It's a question that we should think more broadly, because if we don't change our perspective, then nothing has changed. It is nothing. So we need to focus on our perspective to see things and act upon them differently. That's I think the point here, and I want to leave these implications. Maybe we can discuss them later. There's a matrix here showing us there will be onto-epistemo-ethical implications, 3 of them: decentering the human, critique of dualisms in our curriculum and teaching attitudes, and rethinking responsibility. Under methodological implications, of course, systems thinking have been discussed a lot recently, and they are wonderful discussions. But if we still approach systems thinking from human-centered perspective, it may not be systems-level thinking. That's a concern we maybe think about. And this corresponds to two implications, additional implications. One of them is the entanglement of material and immaterial sensibilities and perceptions, and the other one is how technologies are changing our systems level thinking. And pedagogically, I pay maybe more attention to pedagogical implications, because militaries expect their personal soldiers to be creative and critical. But our education system may not support this enough. So maybe a post-human framework of ethical responsibility, adaptive learning, and learning beyond humans may prepare post-human soldiers for a post-human era. Thank you for listening. I look forward to the discussions.
Thank you, Chaire. And finally, I'm going to turn it over to Ali Tkachenko. Ali is a PhD student in international relations and Canadian politics at the University of Victoria, and she's a research fellow with the North American and Arctic Defense Security Network. Her research focuses on climate security, Arctic politics, and civil disobedience. Ali is also a CSAC fellow from last year. Ali is interested in questions regarding the intersection of environmental politics and security, climate protest and resistance, and current issues affecting Canada's Pacific coast. Go ahead, Ali.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for having me at another CSAC event. Really nice to be here. I'm going to be discussing a working paper that I plan to have form sort of part of my thesis. Hope I can cite it in the thesis, basically. This paper examines the current intersections of gender with defense institutional climate security policy and planning. So I'd like to use an ecological security lens to suggest that we need to reframe our conceptualization of the intersection of gender and climate security to see relevant areas of development for NATO and global North states more generally. So, as you might be aware, there's already quite a strong body of research on the gendered impacts of climate change. Climate change is often discussed as a threat multiplier within this literature, seeing climate change as something that can reveal or exacerbate existing gender-differentiated vulnerabilities. Research often touches on these themes, many more as well. We see lots of discussion around vulnerabilities related to resource scarcity, natural disasters, migration, and how gender-based violence can intersect with all of these areas. What a lot of the conversation around gender and climate security thus far has in common is that it is firstly focused largely, not exclusively, but largely on the global south, and it's often framed in human security terms. So we know human security is an approach that sort of reorients that focus of security to the individual and the threats that impact people's lived experiences and quality of life. That's sort of a counter to those traditional discourses of security that focus on states, borders, militaries. These origins and the way that human security has largely been taken up tend to point us geographically towards the global south and point us towards development as the solution to many of these so-called human security threats. So for climate change and gender, human security offered a really natural fit to frame climate-related issues as security threats to women and girls specifically. We see lots of studies. These graphs are from a recent publication that correlates countries' scores on the Women, Peace and Security Index with their resilience to climate change on different indices, showing that countries who are doing better with respect to gender equality also tend to be countries that are more resilient to climate change. And in this case, this is really good information, this is great to know, but it seems to imply that there are states who need those development solutions that are also really sensitive to gender disparities. And there are those states who have sort of achieved gender equality and who are also safe or safer from climate change. And we know that this just isn't the case. So where are the gaps in this kind of analysis, right? When it comes to climate security and when it comes to thinking about gender and climate change in a more global north-oriented defense institutional context, this doesn't quite get us all the way towards solutions that are applicable for this group of people, for example. If we're only thinking about gender as a pre-existing vulnerability and only looking at those development-based solutions, we're missing the experiences of many women in the global north, and we're not looking at how gender and climate security needs specific solutions for our context in Canada and in NATO. So despite this sort of mismatch between that dominant approach to gender and climate security, we still see that human security, gender-based vulnerability framing as the dominant way that gender is considered in climate security planning in the global north. So I've started to look at some of NATO's major climate security policy and planning documents, and we see that, first of all, gender is very rarely mentioned. And second, when it is, we still only see it framed as a specific vulnerability within that human security kind of approach. So I've looked at 6 key climate security policy documents from 2021 to 2024 to see if and how gender is incorporated. And overall, each document contains terms relating to gender or women between 0 and 4 times each, 4 at most. And when either gender or women or related terms are mentioned, it's always within some kind of human security style quote implying that gender is a specific vulnerability. My very favorite is one of the impact assessment reports that discusses in the executive summary how they will use a women, peace, and security framework throughout the report and then never mentions that term again. I love that. If we come at the intersection of climate security and gender in a different way from the opposite side, we can also look at how existing initiatives on gender and security have incorporated climate change. So in this regard, we might start from the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which is turning 25 this year. And this is a clear area to see how gender is being discussed at a similar level to the policy documents discussed previously. If we look at national action plans on women, peace, and security, we see that only 17 out of 80 national action plans mention climate change at all. And of these, only 3 national action plans discuss specific measures and goals related to climate security and gender. Those are coming from Finland, Ireland, and the USA, so maybe it'll only be 2 action plans in the near future. Canada's National Action Plan discusses climate change as a small part of a few focus areas, but it really stays within that framing as climate change is just increasing the risk of gender-based violence, disrupting access to healthcare, education, and so on. We're seeing some scholars argue that the barriers to robust implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda and serious action combating climate change have similar systemic origins. So there's a great article that came out recently that argues that the Women, Peace and Security Agenda overlooks the global economic dynamics, which are the same dynamics that are contributing to climate change and making major transformations difficult in both areas. So overall, we see whether we look at policies and scholarship that look at climate security through a gender perspective or that looks at gender from a climate security perspective, we end up in the same place. So I would like to suggest that we need a different framework for moving beyond these analytical limitations to create policy that addresses climate security and its gender dimensions. If we turn to an approach called ecological security, we can take something of a wider lens on conventional security paradigms to look at the biosphere itself and our relationship to it. Ecological security takes ecosystems themselves, as well as vulnerable communities and future generations, to be the referent objects of security. And in order to secure these referent objects, ecological security calls for a radical reorganization of our current social, economic, and political systems to meaningfully provide climate security. So this requires us to really denaturalize and deeply critique those economic and institutional structures that have separated people from the environment and that have enabled climate change and environmental degradation to continue. So while human security reorients the conversation around individuals, and it similarly does call attention to vulnerable people, ecological security emphasizes those interconnected systems such as ecosystems, economic systems, and their relations to each other. And I would like to argue that using this kind of lens to conceptualize those connections between gender and climate security can help us find more meaningful, transformative directions for policy to take that fall outside of those typical human security solutions. So what might this look like? Well, a few suggestions, and I'm open to critiques. We could focus on centering ecological systems, and this can shift climate security in planning in ways that can support women's outcomes. So if we take seriously the possibility of placing ecosystems at the center of our security planning, not in the sense of roping off specific areas, but meaning that we look at a specific ecosystem and ask how we can ensure its functioning into the future, that can have the downstream effect of also supporting women and everybody who depends on the functioning of that ecosystem. So this can look like traditional geographic areas of concern like sub-Saharan Africa, but we can also think of key ecological systems such as the AMOC or the Arctic, and consider how securing these can have downstream effects of securing women in those regions. Secondly, climate security plans could incorporate questions of land ownership as an issue of both ecological and women's security in a time of climate change. Studies have shown that when land is managed by local communities, and particularly by women and Indigenous communities, the ecological outcomes are better. We see improved resilience to changes in climate and weather, better water management, and so on. This also ties into decolonization goals, so further focusing efforts on vulnerable communities. And this is highly applicable in the global north in general and in Canada specifically. By supporting our Indigenous nations in the fair settlement of land claims, we are also supporting gender equality and climate security. And then finally, as we continue to integrate disaster relief and crisis response with climate security and militaries, we need to be able to apply a gender lens to see how militarized responses to climate-related events might increase insecurity for women in affected areas. For Canada specifically, this is a really important thing to consider going forward. You know, it's relevant to point out that 2 of the 4 Operation Lentis deployments in 2024 were to areas that were either mostly or entirely within First Nations. And we know that the presence of military in vulnerable and Indigenous communities often leads to higher levels of gender-based violence in those areas. A quick example to finish off. Another place where a gender and ecological security perspective can be helpful is looking at wildfire response. This seems to be a recurring conversation in rooms such as ours. We often talk about how to bolster our crisis response, how to set up non-military disaster responses and deal with climate-related crises like our growing wildfire seasons. And we're often missing an ecological and a gender perspective on these discussions. So we're seeing increased programs aimed at getting more women and diverse groups into wildfire fighting. So for example, Banff has a Women in Fire Training Exchange program, and there's many of these that either exist or are popping up more and more. But as we see climate security initiatives linking defense and crisis response, we can view these programs in a few different ways. On the one hand, do these initiatives fulfill a women, peace, and security mandate to increase the representation of women in male-dominated fields like firefighting? Potentially. Or does encouraging women to go into a field that we know comes with serious personal safety and long-term health risks shift the focus away from those deeper, longer-term ecological solutions and sort of put a pink label on what's really a band-aid reactionary response to climate change? In reality, we probably need both more female firefighters and longer-term solutions, but we need a way to have these conversations that isn't simply framed as women's equality in firefighting or human security of vulnerable women. So hopefully this was interesting, and I would love to hear any comments or feedback. This is early stages. The PowerPoint might not look like it is, but it is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we've had 5 very diverse presentations this morning. One looking at how war is affecting the climate change problem, a couple looking at national or regional dimensions of climate change in Africa and climate security challenges, especially the challenges of bottom-up coordination with national policymaking, and a couple of wider presentations that focus on the gender challenge in climate security policymaking and research, and finally the issue of how we actually train our military officers to deal with the climate problem in the context of different forms of knowledge. All right, well, unless there's any other comments, I think that's it for this first panel. I'd like to thank our panelists, everybody, online and in person.